The IRGC is a bad group of people. They've killed Americans. They've exported their terror, throughout the region and even beyond the Middle East. If anybody is deserving of being bombed, they're in that category of Trump. He does tend to offer people off-ramps. There's a way out of this where we don't have to, kill each other. And then if they don't take that off-ramp, then of course you kind of continue and do what you need to do.
You're quite widely known for having volunteered with the Ukrainian army between 2022 and 2025. Did you get a sense that the Russian advance may not be as sharp as we were sometimes led to believe?
The Russian military is not nearly as professional as I think the West thought it was. Some of their soldiers are getting like 1 week of training. Putin just expects his advisors to give him information, and if his advisors are terrified to tell him the truth, it means he's operating off of a false assumption. If the Russians were allowed to succeed, that encourages other bullies to do more of this. It has to be beaten back.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest today, Nate Vance. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on. You are a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, and you were a volunteer combatant for the Ukrainian army against Russia's act of imperial aggression in Ukraine. So there's a lot I want to ask you about. Some listeners may also know that you are a first cousin of JD Vance, the Vice President of the US. And I've been following some of the comments you've been making in recent years and your experiences that you've had, particularly in Ukraine. But I think it's fair to say that you are a man familiar with the theatre of war, and you're someone who understands it both politically, I guess, but also in terms of your personal experience. So I wanted to kick off just by asking you about contemporary events, if that's all right, before we dig into some of your own experiences. I wonder if I could just ask you what you think about the war that everyone in the world is currently talking about, which is the Iran war, and how that's progressing, whether you think that's going well, whether you think that's a good idea. What do you think about events over there right now?
It's fairly polarizing, but, so politically speaking, I mean, my personal take is that the IRGC and the Islamic Republic are, if anybody is deserving of being bombed, I think they're in that category of deserving it. They're not a good organization, and the world would be better off without them. Obviously that comes with some pain, for the rest of the world because of the oil traffic that goes to the Strait of Hormuz. And, militarily speaking, I think between the United States and Israeli militaries, it's domination from a military perspective, but the political side of it and the political fallout from those higher costs of energy, that part of it I try to stay away from because, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder, whether or not each individual person's willing to pay that price. And I can't determine that for everybody.
Yeah, we have a similar discussion here in the UK about whether the political price is one worth paying. What's your sense of, in terms of the military expedition itself? You say it's dominant power by America and Israel, and that is my impression too. But if you read some of the Western media, you could get the impression that Iran is winning, at least morally, if not necessarily militarily. We sometimes hear from the New York Times and others that America might be on the cusp of suffering at least a strategic defeat, if not necessarily a military one. What have you made of that kind of discussion? Do you think there's any truth in that, or does it smack you as kind of moral defeatism, that kind of take on what's happening there?
I think it is. I think there's a significant portion of the American mass media, that America in particular, that it's hard to separate the politics from the analysis, right? Like everybody is a little biased. So if you don't like the guy that's ordering the thing, then you don't like the thing he's ordering a little bit. And I think that's part of what you're seeing in some of the media portrayals. And then there's also a lack of understanding of, I think, what's really going on the ground over there and what the objectives are. That's one of the objectives are pretty clear cut to me. I mean, they said them out loud, but I think some people are kind of confused as to what the objectives are. And I don't know why, because they said them in plain English. So, and then, the one thing that I do think confuses people is like, okay, let's stop shooting at each other and try to make a deal, right? Like right in the middle of it. That's a very Trumpian thing that only he does, right? So that kind of confuses people at times. And but I do think the political biases of the people writing these stories sometimes gets in the way of their, fair and unbiased analysis of what's going on.
You will know better than most people that one of the key aspects to, I guess, a victory in a war is the willingness to stay the course and not to signal to the enemy that you want a way out or you're feeling morally exhausted. I mean, that's one of the lessons of Ukraine, I guess, which I will come on to in a second. But do you think the White House will stay the course on this conflict? There's already discussion about possibly a divergence between Israel and America, where Israel wants to push harder. The White House might want a way out, might want to tone things down. Do you think there is, even though there's military strength on display, do you think there is that kind of political will to pursue this to the end?
I think so. I think there is. I mean, if you look at the amount of C-17s that have been transiting across the Atlantic, I don't think they're bringing cheeseburgers. I think they're bringing more supplies. That indicates, even just that indicates kind of a willingness to continue. And I do think, and look, I'm perfectly willing to criticize Trump if I disagree with him. But in this particular case, I think one of the things he does, that it's confusing to people, but he does tend to offer people off ramps, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there's debate about whether or not pausing in the middle of a conflict, you could give the enemy time to kind of recover, things like that. And that's a perfectly adequate discussion to be had. But I also don't think it's inappropriate to say to somebody like, hey, if there's a way out of this where we don't have to, kill each other. And then if they don't take that off ramp, then of course you kind of continue and do what you need to do to achieve your objectives.
And what's your sense of things, how things are on the home front, I guess, amongst ordinary Americans, for want of a better term? We're seeing a lot of everything is filtered to us here through the BBC and the British media, who aren't necessarily always reliable, but we are seeing reports of polling finding that a lot of Americans are not down with this war. They're worried about it. They're worried about being hit in the pocket, but they're also worried that perhaps Trump is reneging on his promise to, leave in history the forever wars of past presidents and to wind down those kind of eternal foreign conflicts. Is that a live discussion amongst ordinary Americans? What have you made of that kind of discussion?
I mean, of course, the people that I'm around every day, it's anecdotal, right? And I do have some social media presence, and people that are on social media discussing politics are usually like, rabid consumers of political discourse. So, they're a little bit more opinionated than the average American running around. So I don't know if that's a good snapshot either. But, for the most part, people are like, yeah, they don't like the high gas prices. They also do tend to understand, at least the ones that I've talked to, that, the IRGC is a bad group of people, and they've killed Americans. They've exported their terror, throughout the region and even beyond the Middle East. So they get that they're bad guys and they want them to be gone. And there is some looming kind of concern about this becoming a forever war. And, just coming off of 20 years of the global war on terror, 2 decades, right? That concern's always it seems to be in the back of people's minds. But I think once people look at it and then they go, look, we have not been building up the kind of ground troops. You know what I mean? Like before we went into Iraq, for example, it was 6 months of building up ground troops, and that's not happening. So I don't think there's any real indications that we're going to invade Iran and try to hold the territory. I don't think anybody's going to do that. And I think the public generally kind of understands that this will be, historically speaking, a blip on the historical radar. I don't think it's going to be a super long-term thing.
That's my sense too. I get slightly frustrated when people say it's another Iraq, because it does seem to be quite different to Iraq from what I can see. Do you think it's overblown then when people say that there is this huge gaping divide emerging in the Maga movement, where you have one side that's lining up with Trump and saying, listen, the IRCG and the mullahs need to be dealt with. And you have another side saying he's betrayed us, he's let us down. And they're all kind of following Tucker Carlson or whoever else it might be. There does seem to be some tensions there, of course. But as you say, things on the internet are not always reflective of the real world. Is there a divide in the MAGA movement from your perspective?
There's dissenters, but like you got, Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and these people that kind of think Israel is like, secretly running the universe, like, it's a tiny country the size of New Jersey and they're running Earth. You know what I mean? And those people, I don't think it's a majority. It exists. And then I think another aspect of that is this is Trump's second term in office. So you get a lot of people that are thinking about a political life after Trump, right? And it's kind of like an episode of Survivor where they're trying to pick their little team, but that's normal, right? That's a normal political thing that happens all the time. Everybody but it's just, there's so many eyes on this administration that I think it seems like it's a bigger deal than it really is. So I'm not that concerned about it. Republicans are going to vote Republican. They're not going to suddenly vote for Kamala Harris. It's not going to, not large numbers anyway.
Let's hope not. One of the things that we've heard about too, and I'm not expecting you to have any special insight into this, but you will be familiar with the public discussion about it, is that there's a divide at the top of the White House, possibly between the president and the vice president. Lots of people commented on the fact that the VP was pretty quiet on social media when the war started, but he does seem to have taken on a pretty large responsibility over the past couple of weeks in terms of trying to strike this deal and trying to make it work in that region. Do you get a sense from the public, from what we know publicly, that there might be tensions at the top of the White House, or is that another example of these kinds of things being exaggerated?
I think some of these people that report on this stuff, their job is to essentially peddle in the sensational. So they'll take anything and be like, look, if me and you had a meeting about a task that we needed to get done, and you said, I think we should go left, and I'm like, mate, have we considered going right? The media is going to be like, Nate and Brendan are totally diametrically opposed to it. It's like, well, we're just, like it's any group you're going to have like, a little, and I don't even know that even happened, right? But the point is they'll take any little, suggestion of doing something different as a complete, they're fighting and trying to, they're knives out, you know what I mean? That's not reality. So I think those things are significantly overblown, especially when the news reporting is an unnamed source told me.
Yeah, I always get quite skeptical when it's an unnamed source, and it very often is an unnamed source. Okay, I want to ask you about some of your own experience and your fighting experience to begin with, particularly in Ukraine. So I mentioned earlier you're a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, but I think you're quite widely known for having volunteered with the Ukrainian army between 2022 and 2025, I believe, which I think personally is a very brave thing to do. But I wonder what compelled you to do that. What was it, aside from the obvious, I guess, what was it about that conflict that made you as an individual think, I need to go over there?
When I first went over there, I had no goal of actually picking up arms and fighting. It was not what I intended to do. I just intended to do like humanitarian stuff. I actually worked in oil and gas at the time. My schedule was 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And I was like, well, I'll just spend my 2 weeks off, doing something worthwhile instead of sitting around at a bar. And it just kind of, I guess in a very American fashion, I just kind of mission crept myself and, slowly kind of migrated east, and then, saw some things I didn't like about what the Russians were doing, and then figured that the best way I could help is, a bunch of young volunteer soldiers with zero military experience. And, me, I'm not like super soldier or anything, but when you have no training or no experience with it, somebody with even any training is pretty valuable to have around, so there was just a lot of guys volunteering and not necessarily enough bandwidth to train them all adequately. So I was like, maybe I can help more at the front. And then it just kind of slowly morphed into fighting. So it was really just, okay, I think this is the place where I'm the most valuable and where I can help the most.
What kind of fighting did you see? I mean, people will be, listeners will be very interested to know what that experience is like, because again, we see this conflict filtered through the media. We often hear when there are attacks, especially when something happens in Kyiv, that always makes the news, but we don't often hear coverage about what's happening in the East, except we might see a map every now and then saying Russia's got this far and Ukraine's got that far, but it all feels a bit abstract and a bit distant to us. So did you fight in the East, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, all over the front, basically from, near Zaporizhia all the way up to Kupiansk. But it depends on the region and where you were. Like, obviously, some areas at certain times were a little bit hotter than others. But I guess I'm trying to think of like the most concise way to put it. And I was actually trying to explain it to an American general at one point in time. And because the weapons and the drones and things like that are so accurate, you know what I mean? That you literally have a guy controlling some of the things that are coming after you, that you have to spread out so much where you lose, like, you think back to like the 19th century, everybody's standing shoulder to shoulder. The commander is within earshot of every troop that he is in command of. Command and control is relatively easy in that environment. And because, the progression of weapons getting more effective, you start seeing formations spread out further and further and further. And you end up to where you're in little tiny groups. Sometimes communication doesn't work because you're jammed. And the way that American general said, he's like, it would be like Normandy on, June 5th at midnight when you got dropped in and you had a bunch of just, random groups of soldiers trying to kind of work together, but with no ability to kind of communicate. Now, those communication systems were getting better and better as things were going. So they might be better now than they were when I left. But, still, there was a long way to go to get it. It's never as good as you want it to be. So yeah, it's hard to articulate, in a 30-second soundbite what it's like. But there's enough videos online. People can go get a sense of it if they really, want to seek that out.
I've seen some of those videos. The videos I've seen of the drone attacks are particularly terrifying. As you say, these are drones that are controlled and they almost chase men around. I mean, it is a horrifying thing to see. In relation to the front, one thing that we occasionally hear is about the moral exhaustion of the Russian army, or certainly that they may be suffering more losses than is often confirmed or revealed, and that it may, for all of Putin's bluster, this actually might be a military machine that is flagging a little bit, or surprised, I guess, by the strength of the resistance that it met inside Ukraine. Was that your sense? I mean, I guess it must be hard to tell on the front line when you're right up against fighting men. But more broadly, more politically, did you get a sense that the Russian advance may not be as sharp and as confident as we were sometimes led to believe?
Oh, 100%. I mean, and I got it wrong too. Like, before the war even started, I was like, man, I feel really bad for the Ukrainians because this is not going to go well for them, right? Like, that was my thought. This is probably one of the reasons that I decided to go, is because I was surprised. Right. So it's like, okay, let me see what's actually going on here. Right. It seemed like something I needed to, or at least I desired to figure out what the reality was. And, the reality is the Russian military is not nearly as professional as I think the West thought it was. Some of their soldiers are getting like 1 week of training. Now, that's not to say that they have no professional soldiers. That's a dangerous, kind of thought process to have, because you can run into some that are professional and then have a bad day. But clearly, I think even the Russians were surprised. They'll never admit it. And particularly with Putin, I think, if you give Putin bad news, like people that give Putin bad news tend to fall out of windows or, have a drink of really bad tea. So, he's just not going to get bad news, which means he's not going to really be informed. And he, even by his own admission, he doesn't consume media, right? Like he doesn't watch the news. He doesn't read the newspaper. So he just expects his advisors to give him information. And if his advisors are terrified to tell him the truth, it means he's operating off of a false assumption. And if he seems illogical, it's probably because he's not, making decisions based on accurate information.
I've seen some people refer to Ukraine as almost like Russia's Vietnam in the sense that it seems that it's getting increasingly bogged down. Things aren't going in the way that it might have hoped. And I'm sure there is a lot of sadness and sorrow for Russian families who are losing their young sons in this war. I guess there are echoes of America's experience in the Vietnam conflict in that sense. Do you think that that's justified? Do you think this might actually blow back on not only on Putin, but I guess on Russia and its sense of confidence in the world?
I think so, eventually. Something tells me, I mean, that's a very low trust society, Russia. You're not necessarily allowed to come out and voice your opinions the same way, at least not as comfortably as we can do it in our home countries. So I would venture to say that like a lot of Russians are already upset. They're just not able to protest. I mean, you go to prison for protesting against the war. So, but that doesn't mean they don't have opinions, in here. So I think there's probably a lot of unhappy people. There's at least 1 million families, right, that have lost someone. And that's, you get into a country, I think Russia's 170-ish million people. So, 1 million people, that's not very many families that don't have someone that they know or a neighbor or somebody that's been maimed or killed in this conflict. And sooner or later, I think that will, and then like Vietnam, I think for Russia, this is probably the first conflict they've been in where they can watch it, right? Where they can see these things happening to their young men. And, that does something to people. I mean, I know, they're culturally slightly different than we are, but still, watching your youth be torn apart on TV in front of you daily is got to be hard to watch.
Absolutely. You talked earlier about how even with someone with some training like you, perhaps you're being slightly self-effacing there, but you have had some training. Even that kind of person was valuable in Ukraine amongst many men who'd had no training at all. But I wonder if you could say something about any sense of moral mission you might have felt, as well as that sense of military usefulness. I mean, what was it about the Ukrainian conflict that you thought was worth sacrificing 3 years of your life and taking enormous risks? What do you think is at stake there politically and morally that people in the West should be conscious of?
I've said this several times, but the post-World War II era they refer to as the Pax Americana, right? And that's like basically, I know it doesn't seem like it when you watch the news, but that period of time, that roughly 80, 90-year period, is comparatively like one of the most peaceful times in world history, right? And you didn't have, for that 80 to 90-year period, you didn't have major imperial wars, especially in Europe. And when I, saw the invasion, obviously, whether there's a territorial dispute, I mean, I know which side of it I'm on, but there's a debate, it's political, and then one side decided to invade the other. Well, that's like the guy who throws the first punch is always wrong. And that's kind of how I look at this conflict. Like Russia was wrong to invade and just start killing people over basically nothing. I mean, I think their points of contention are nonsense, So, if the Russians were allowed to succeed, that encourages other bullies to do more of this, right? And that's where I think you can see conflicts kind of spread. Every country has alliances. Those alliances get drawn in. That's how 2 world wars started. So there was something about this that just, I thought to myself, this can't be allowed to succeed. It has to be beaten back. And I still feel that way. So
one thing that's worried me over the past 2 years in particular is it seems there's the flagging enthusiasm in Europe for the conflict in Ukraine. And by that, I mean by a kind of flagging enthusiasm for the Ukrainian cause, we might describe it as. European governments seem quite cagey about it, not really willing to contribute the resources that might be needed. And even amongst the commentariat in Europe and in parts of America, I would say too, there's a kind of creeping cynicism about the Ukrainian cause. I wonder if you've noticed that in the public discussion, and whether that had any impact on the ground in Ukraine. Was it something that filtered through to people there?
I didn't no, we're doing what we were doing. Like I wasn't paying attention to what people in Europe or America were saying. We got things to do. Certainly noticed it when I left and came home. I noticed it a lot more, but I don't think it really negatively impacts the guys. Like the guys that are fighting are busy, right? And they're like, okay, cool. Some guy in Kansas doesn't like us. All right, cool, whatever. I never meet that guy in my life. I don't care. So, Ukrainians are pretty resolute. I don't think they're going to be, they're not going to let the opinions of somebody who's not in Ukraine and has no concept of what the conflict is kind of deter them from what they're doing.
You mentioned Pax Americana earlier, and one thing that the Ukraine conflict has done, unintentionally, because wars often have strange, unintentional global consequences, is it does seem to have driven a bit of a divide between America and Europe. And of course, one of the big discussions over the past year or so in particular has been, when will Europe take more responsibility for its security? Is it always going to rely on America? Does America always have to stump up the resources and the costs, even for a conflict in Ukraine? What have you made of that? Do you think this is a kind of huge chasm between America and Europe, or more of a blip? How do you read that kind of response to what's happened in Ukraine?
I think it'll be a blip eventually. I mean, the concept of European nations doing more to defend themselves, there's some legitimacy to that argument, right? It's not an incorrect argument, and sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And sometimes Trump, no matter how you feel about him, does not put things delicately. I'll just say it that way. So, there's a way to make that argument, but, then again, it's not like Trump's been bringing this up since his first term in office. So maybe he's frustrated. I don't know. I don't like to speak for the administration at all. But I do agree in the general sense that, Europeans, Europe collectively, right? I'm painting with a broad brush here. Could benefit from the ability to exercise a little deterrence, right? And some of that deterrence is just having a strong enough, large enough force in place all the time. It's a question we'll never know the answer to, but if they had a strong enough force in place in 2021, would this war have even happened? We can't really answer that, but, anyway, yeah, I'm trying to stay away from that. That's a touchy subject. There's a lot of, like, people get upset, so.
They do. But I agree for what it's worth. I think it would be a good thing if a country like Britain was able to look after itself militarily and not have to rely on others, because you never know what's going to happen in the future. A couple of final questions for you, Nate. I wanted to ask you about the Zelensky phenomenon, because I have found it actually quite depressing, to some of the commentary that has come out about Zelensky over the past couple of years. Again, a lot of it's been driven by those kind of hotheads on the internet who call him, the great welfare queen of global affairs. He keeps coming with his begging bowl. He won't even wear a suit. I mean, everyone knows the arguments that have been made. You were quoted on the BBC last year when there was the blow up in the White House between the president and the vice president and Zelensky. I think a lot of people were watching that through their fingers, not quite sure what to make of it. What do you think drove that kind of the turn against Zelensky that we had for a period of time? And did that have any impact in Ukrainian politics, do you think?
In Ukrainian politics, again, I didn't know, like, Ukrainians don't care what Americans are talking about. Not really. I mean, there's a few of them, that are kind of like on the social media scene. But for the most part, they're like, dude, I gotta go to work. You know what I mean? My power's out like 6 hours a day sometimes. In some cases, they're like, I don't care what some people are arguing about in the United States. I mean, they think about it, right? Like in the general sense, they're like, man, we'd like to have America as a friend. We're kind of a good friend to have if we're, everything's going well. But ultimately they're like, yeah, you'll be our friend or you won't. Either way, we're going to keep fighting Russia until we can't anymore, right? So ultimately it doesn't matter to them. But I think what drove that was politics. Just politics in general. We're so binary. in the United States because we have the two-party system, which I know confounds the European mind for the most part. But we think yours is as weird as you think ours is, right? So it's the feeling's mutual, but the two-party system, I think what happens is you end up in situations where, you're running against Joe Biden, for example, and whatever Joe Biden's doing has to be bad. So if Joe Biden supports, the thing, and then if you tell yourself something enough times, you kind of start to believe it. So I think that's part of it, right? Where it's like, we got to do the opposite of what this guy's doing, and we got to tell everybody we're going to do the opposite. And then there's some parts of it are legitimate, right? Like, so for the people in the U.S. that are like, hey, is this fiscally responsible to, give away $80 billion every 9 months? You can't fault people for asking that question. That's a perfectly legitimate question to ask. But, and then that drives it. When people see those large numbers, a lot of them don't understand the way that money is allocated and what happens with it. And then you mix that with politics. And I think that's where you get a lot of that vitriol.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. It's when the legitimate questions about how public money is spent kind of tipped over into just this kind of slightly irrational anti-Zelensky worldview that when the one became the other, that's when I think things went a bit crazy. Okay, Nate, my last question for you is just on what you think might happen next in Ukraine. I think you and I both want Ukraine to be victorious in its resistance of Russia's invasion. How are things looking from your perspective? I'm sure you still keep a close eye on it. Is victory a possibility, whether in the medium term or the long term? What's your view there?
Well, in the very general sense, as long as you got a heartbeat, you got a puncher's chance. And I'm not saying that to be like dismissive of it. There are some positive signs I'm seeing. The Ukraine seems to be significantly pulling ahead in the drone front. Which, essentially neither side can really achieve air superiority in the traditional sense that we think of it. So their air war is essentially a drone war. And whoever is going to dominate that is probably going to emerge successful. And you're starting to see, a fledgling sense of air dominance in this. It was kind of evenly matched for a long time. But it looks like the Ukrainians are not only producing more drones, but they're producing drones with, like higher payload capacity. And they're able to strike targets deeper into Russian-held territory. And if that trend continues and it gets very lopsided, then I think that will spell some pretty significant problems for the Russian military. And I hope that does happen. So yeah, things are trending well, but I'm always very cautiously optimistic. There's been times I've gotten excited and then, been pretty disappointed afterwards. So I got my fingers crossed, but I'm also prepared for more of the same.
Nate, thank you very much.
Thank you.